Now, one of the other things that also starts to happen with this is also the demise of morality. So over time, what begins to emerge is a realization that, when we use words like good and evil, we're using broadly abstract, non-empirical terms. So if we're going to talk about morality, how do we possibly talk about good and evil in empirical terms? And what happens is, well, the very thing that happened in the ancient world. The atomists, the Epicureans, the sort of proto-nominalists of this movement had reduced morality to pleasure and pain. That really, when we talk about good and evil, we're talking about pleasure and pain. And so in these sort of new nominalists, right, in modernity, what you start to see is the same thing. Morality becomes reduced to pleasure and pain. And this is where the theories of progress ultimately start to have this sort of materialist, atheist, hedonistic impulse to them. So whether you're talking about people like Auguste Comte or you're talking about people like Jeremy Bentham, what you start to see is a utilitarianism emerge, where rather than good and evil, right and wrong being rooted somehow in the structures of nature, right, natural law, as in the early realist tradition, or having to do with the innate natures of things and the sort of conformity to those natures, conformity to the forms, what you start to see is that right and wrong, good and evil are reducible to pleasure and pain. And ultimately, an act is judged by its utility or its usefulness in inducing pleasure and removing pain or avoiding pain. So you start to get the developments of departments like, sociology and anthropology. A lot of these sorts of early movements in modernity were based on two things. One, they are based on a certain scientific optimism that we can engineer humanity. And that actually is quite literally what they were aimed at doing. They're aimed at observing human behavior in, social contexts, anthropology, and cultural contexts and things like that, in order to basically reverse engineer a way of engineering human behavior. Why did they want to engineer human behavior? Well, because it was presumed that they could in this way force progress forward. What being progress? Well, that we begin to raise the level of happiness amongst humanity, by which they meant increased levels of pleasure and decreased levels of pain. And so we can engineer that through social engineering. If we understand what causes human behavior to move in this direction or that, then we can begin to top down, begin to re-engineer humanity toward the sorts of behavior that we find useful for happiness overall. And so that was really the aim of these sorts of things. So when you talk about, a sort of a view of progress, right? Progressing toward what? Well, progressing toward the engineering of humanity toward this increased state of happiness, decreased state of pain. And with that was also reflective of the burgeoning materialism. So one of the things you also see is that in the ancient philosophy, there's a high degree of belief in free will. Because this was seen as an obvious feature of morality and of justice and, our moral intuitions and the rest. Whereas the more the nominalist empiricist framework took hold, the more you saw that humanity was viewed as just sort of matter in motion. There was a greater degree of skepticism that we have free choice as opposed to being psychologically and materially determined. And for that reason, there was also a great degree of optimism that the engineering project was completely possible. Because us just being matter in motion, of course we can figure out how the billiard balls bang into each other, and then we can engineer a better pathway forward. And so this is the rise of utilitarianism. This is the rise of Marxism. And on the contrary side, you have the rise of Nietzscheanism. So Nietzscheanism actually does also embrace a certain form of the dialectic, right? It understands that history is advancing forward. But the difference is Nietzsche thinks that the thing that's driving it forward is the will to power. That really, at the end of the day, what underlies everything is just a groping forth of power. Now, with Nietzsche, there was a real question of how do you explain things like altruism? How do you explain these sort of idyllic philosophies like Christianity, where supposedly you're supposed to love your enemy, right? You're supposed to turn the other cheek and so on. as well as its sort of prelude, the prelude to Christianity and Judaism. And according to Nietzsche, how he tried to explain that was what he called it is a subversive will to power. The idea that, yes, on the one hand, you have power struggles that are overt. I'm going to take your stuff, right? I'm going to conquer your people, whatever it may be. But he suggests that Judaism represented a subversive will to power, what he called slave morality, hearkening, of course, to the fact that the Jews were enslaved in Egypt. And so what Nietzsche suggests is that if you're a smaller, weaker people like the Jews, right, who can't conquer all the surrounding peoples, what do you do, right? How do you stand up to those bigger, stronger peoples? And Nietzsche's claim was, well, what you do is you villainize them, you demonize them. You tell them, you shame them for being strong. You suggest that there is a God who favors us. He favors the meek and the mild. He favors us because we're small. And you who are oppressive and strong, you are the villains, right? And you try to in some ways shame them for their strength. Why do you do that? Well, in the hope that what they'll do is that being shamed for being strong, they end up seeking basically, they seek absolution, right? They lay down their weapons. They try to repent, right? Apologizing basically for being strong and submitting themselves to the weaker group that's favored by God in order to try to absolve themselves of this shameful, strength that they have. And so Nietzsche suggests that's a subversive will to power. It's still a will to power. It's just not obvious because it's not forward-facing aggression. It's instead, this sort of subversive, shaming will to power. And he suggests that this is what's there also in things like Christianity and the rest, because he suggests you really want to see what's, you want to see what's underneath the skirt of Christianity. Just look at the doctrine of hell, right? That there's still this sort of like, our enemies will burn forever in hellfire, right? That's the real spirit that's underneath there. It's still a will to power. It's just sort of veiled in this, well, for right now, we'll be the meek and the mild and the martyrs and love our enemies and so on. But they're really holding out for, for that reckoning with their enemies and so on. Anyway, but the point is for Nietzsche, what you get is this contrast between sort of right and left Hegelianism, right? Nietzsche represents really sort of the prelude to Nazism. And the relationship between Nazism and Nietzsche is, a long, complicated one. But the point is that what you start to get there is what Nietzsche advocates is saying, no, what you should recognize is that power is the good, right? Like that's the main good that we have. And all of us are in a power struggle, whether we want to or not. And so you should not be ashamed of being strong. Rather, you should embrace your strength and crush the skulls of the weak and use that power and not submit to this nonsense about being shamed. Just recognize it for what it is. It's a subversive tactic to get you to lay down your weapons when in fact you should be rather proud of the fact that you're strong. So this is really what you see as the trajectory of nominalism. Reason begins to very quickly unravel in the hands of the nominalists, giving rise to skepticism. And that skepticism, for all of its efforts to, for all the efforts of the philosophers to overcome it, ultimately it ends up unfolding into atheism, utilitarianism, social engineering, and then on the one hand, Marxism, on the other hand, Nietzscheanism. And in terms of reason itself, this is what gives rise to really post-modernity, where you have deconstruction, where all things are just language, right? And language games. And then the fact of the matter is that way, if we can manipulate and change language, if we can modify definitions, we manipulate and change reality, because ultimately all the structures of reality are just mental fictions that we impose upon reality and so on. And that's where you get into the type of deconstruction, postmodern views of relativistic morality, relativistic definitions, epistemic skepticism, and the rest. There is the one note that the irony is that there is also a high degree of authoritarianism that comes with this sort of nominalist push. By the authoritarianism, I don't necessarily mean, Nazism, though it might manifest in that way. I more mean the fact that having undermined reason itself, there's very few things that you can point to as an authority. And so in this way, to no surprise, nominalism has an impulse to point to the sciences, to the white coats. They become the new priesthood of the world, who have an authoritative stay. They are the ones who, are the priesthood that can peer behind the veil and look at the structures of reality that are too deep for the rest of us to understand and come down from the heavens and report to us what they found. And we just have to sort of submit to those authorities as the only sort of tether to reason and reality and truth itself. Now, that may sound like I'm making a reference to contemporary white coats and things like that, and there's certainly plenty of that in our culture today. But that actually is quite literally what people like Auguste Comte wanted. Auguste Comte recognized that if you're going to engineer a society forward toward a utopia, he actually suggested that you need to find a way to harvest the goods that religion offered. And so he suggested, just like the liturgical calendar has this sort of unifying effect in religion, where you're commemorating certain feast days or fasting at certain times, what you need is you actually need like national holidays, right? You need days that commemorate our secular priesthood, the people who are our secular saints, right? So that sort of secular calendar that commemorates those things, you want that sort of thing. And yes, you want to elevate, really sort of almost to sainthood, but certainly to a priesthood of sorts, the white coats, the folks who are involved in the sciences, who offer us some sort of tether and authority with regard to truth. And then you also want rituals and things like this. So he goes through actually all of these sorts of secular recapitulations of religious rites and practices and things like that in order to try to harvest those. So it's quite true. That's actually very intentionally what people like Auguste Comte in this stream of thought ended up embracing. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow, subscribe, hit like if that's an option on whatever you're listening to. All that sort of stuff really helps us out here. So I greatly appreciate your support. And until next time, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.